Hi everybody. Tonight I want to shoot a video that I've been meaning to do for a little while. I've been promising it for a while. So tonight we're going to shoot it. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience in the hobby. What got me started, what keeps me interested in it, how long I've been doing it, what types of fish I've kept, and that sort of thing. So what got me started in it was a lifelong fascination of fish and aquatic environments. I've just been around it my whole life. I live near the Chesapeake Bay, so I've been around brackish environments my whole life. I've been around saltwater my whole life in some degree or another. I'm not very far from the Atlantic Ocean. I've just always been fascinated by fish. I've always loved fish, but I've always felt growing up that fish keeping was beyond me. I used to keep reptiles, I used to keep snakes, but I never took the step into keeping fish. I always just felt that it was somehow beyond me. Well, not too terribly long ago, my wife brought home a small fish tank that she had at work. She was told she was not allowed to keep personal items like that at work, so she had to bring it home. And I suddenly found that we had a fish tank in the house. It was a very small tank and it sat on our kitchen counter, and I was absolutely enthralled by it. I would just stand there and watch the little fish swim around. It had a few Endler's guppies in it, probably a few other guppies, and it might have had a neon or two, something like that. A very simple tank, very small, very basic. And I knew nothing about it. I knew no rules. I knew no, rules about doing water changes once a week or inch of fish per gallon of water. I knew nothing at all. All I knew was that I was just in love with fish, and we had a fish tank now. And I would occasionally do a water change. I knew you needed to change the water sometimes, but I knew also that there was some sort of mysterious balance that happened in a fish tank, and if you disrupted that, you could really do some damage. Absolute mystery to me. I had no idea what any of that meant. I had no idea how any of that worked. So I was always very cautious about doing water changes. I didn't do them in any kind of regularity, but when I did them, I didn't do them too extreme. I would do maybe 25%. I just assumed that that was pretty safe amount. I was very careful to make sure I matched the temperature of the water. That's about all I knew to do. I had no idea about water hardness or pH or anything like that at all. So this went on for probably 6 months or so, where I was just in love with this fish tank. I would just stand there for, quite a long time every day just watching these fish swim around. Don't know when it happened, but at some point I heard the rule of thumb, which I have discussed in other videos. I've learned quite a bit since then. But I heard this rule that you're supposed to have 1 gallon of water for every inch of fish you have. Now, of course, we had a very small tank, but it also had very few fish in it, and that tank, in retrospect, was fine the way it was. But I saw that we had, several inches of fish. It might have been 3 or 4 inches of fish total, and we had it in this very small half-gallon triangular tank that was designed to go in the corner of a wall. So I thought, well, my goodness, we need to get a bigger tank for these. My wife agreed, now that she had heard that these fish needed more room to swim around in. So we bought our first 10-gallon tank and we set it up in the office. At that point, we now had extra room and I could put some more fish in. And that's kind of when things got started. I really started, looking at fish. Of course, I was just going to my big chain pet store. It's not far. They have a website. I was able to look at the fish and go over some real basic care parameters and see what would fit in my tank and what wouldn't. The same old stuff everybody gets started with. Nothing unusual about that. So that went on for quite a while. I had no idea what was going on with the tank. At that point, I decided I was going to take an interest in my fish and I was going to be diligent with the water changes. And I did disastrous water changes. I would just set up a siphon hose and let it run. It was next to my window. I would just throw the hose out the window and just let the siphon run. And I would just ferry pitchers of water back and forth from the other room. And I would just keep adding water to the tank while I was draining it. And I would just do that for 15 or 20 minutes until I felt like all of the water got, exchanged out of the tank. And I basically completely exchanged the water in the tank. And then I would take the filter out, and I would take that dirty, filthy sponge thing. I never really understood what that was for, but it got really dirty and nasty, so I'd take that in and scrub that all out in hot water and get it nice and clean, and, you know, put a new filter pad in and put that nice, you know, sponge back in. I never understood why the big sponge went after the little sponge, you know. To me it made more sense because I thought it was a mechanical filter. So I finally called the company that manufactured the filter and asked them about it, and they explained what it was. They explained that it was a biofilter and that I should really leave that alone and not scrub it out. In the meantime, I had been battling with fish dying and cloudy water in my tank, and of course the advice I kept getting from my big chain pet store was that it was just a bacterial bloom, and here, have some water clarifier, this will clear it right up. And it did, and then 2 days later it was cloudy again, and I would get more water clarifier, and that went on for weeks. I told them what I was doing. They knew I was scrubbing my biosponge out. They knew I was doing these massive water changes, and the only advice they kept giving me was, well, it's just a bacterial bloom, you'll get over it sooner or later, just keep buying this water clarifier, etc. So while all that was going on, and while I was struggling with all this and couldn't figure out why my water was all cloudy all the time, and of course the cloudier the water got, the more frequently I was doing water changes, etc. So I was just making the problem worse. Meantime, a buddy of mine, my neighbor, got more interested in his fish at the same time. He had been keeping fish for a long time. They just kind of sat in the tank. He didn't really do much other than the 10%, 25%, and 2 pinches of food every day, and he never touched anything. So one day he decided, well, you know, Dan's over there and got all these fish, he's all excited about them, I'll get my tank good and cleaned up. So he did the same thing. He went in and he took the fish out of the tank, he put them in a bucket with an air stone, and he cleaned his tank. And within a few days, all of his fish were swimming upside down and banging into walls, and they all died. And we were baffled. You know, obviously we understood that this big water change is what did it, but why in the world did his fish just die after this big water change? So I typed that into Google. I typed in, why did all my fish die after a big water change? And I came across the term new tank syndrome and the words nitrogen cycle for the first time in my life. And holy cow, that was the starting gun. When I learned about the nitrogen cycle and learned that there was this entire world going on in my tank that was invisible, and it was this whole balanced ecosystem, the fish suddenly became the stuff that was in the tank. The water in my tank suddenly became the important thing, and the microbial and invisible life within that became my focus. And I've said before in other videos that we are water keepers, we are not fish keepers, and this is where all that journey sort of began for me. So from there, I was just off and running. You know, I couldn't stop reading and learning more and discovering more. And suddenly it occurred to me one day, like, there's nothing that says I can only have a single 10-gallon fish tank. Why not get another one? So I bought my first 29-gallon tank, which is now my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. And I started playing with that and experimenting with that. And the big chain pet stores have a 2-week return policy. If for any reason you don't like the fish or it dies or anything, no questions asked, you can just take it back. So I probably went through darn near every fish they have, except for the African cichlids and things that I knew wouldn't work in my water. Again, I was a long way away from learning about my water. We'll get there. I just knew African cichlids needed really hard water, and I knew I had a water softener, so I just assumed I had very soft water, and we left it at that, and I never considered African cichlids. Little do I know now that that would have been the much easier route for me to go, would have been African cichlids than the route I went, which was South American and soft water fish, assuming that my water softener allowed for that. So, at any rate, I was off and running. I was buying fish, I was bringing them home, I was keeping them for a couple of weeks, getting a feel for them, seeing whether I liked them. I went through a lot of fish. I killed a lot of fish. I didn't know what I was doing. I was over-enthusiastic. I way overstocked my tanks. And then I went nuts. I just started buying 10-gallon tanks. What is now my fish room went through many, many changes. I had tanks hanging off the walls. I had tables that I had hostas and ferns growing right up off the tables with fish tanks tucked into them. I had vines growing across stuff. I went nuts with it. It was a blast. I had a lot of fun with it, but none of it was tenable. You know, none of it was stuff I could keep up. Just the humidity down here alone was ridiculous. It was like a jungle. You know, I had to spray the tabletop to water my hostas and stuff. It was just ridiculous, but it was really fun. It was really neat. I got a lot of fantastic ideas about aquascaping, and, you know, I came up with all these neat ideas. I came up with this great idea for a sort of a tank that's in a fish tank on the bottom, and, you know, plants up top, and they grow right out the top of it. Like, I had no idea that there was names for all these things, and, you know, all these great ideas I was coming up with were already well established, you know, within the hobby or anything. As far as I was concerned, they were all new, neat ideas I had come up with, and I just couldn't stop tinkering with this stuff and toying with these things. So I went crazy with that for about a year or two, and finally I sort of started settling down. I felt like I was getting enough experience with the vast array of different fish that were readily available, and I kind of knew what I liked and didn't like. I'd gotten some experience with keeping some different kinds of plants. I already have experience with gardening. I already have experience with lighting, so I kind of had a leg up when it came to that sort of thing. But the water was still a big issue for me. I didn't understand why my fish kept dying, and I didn't understand why, after I kept my nitrogen cycle well intact, I still would lose fish after these large water changes. And that's when I discovered, it was actually a comment from a viewer, and he asked me, why do I use softened water, and would I ever consider not using softened water for my fish? And I said, well, what do you mean? I'd never heard that you should not use softened water for your fish before. I literally had just got lucky that my water was safe enough to go through a softening system. I will again say, don't use softened water for fish. I don't know anything about your water or your fish or anything else. All in all, just don't. It's just not a good idea. There's certain circumstances where it can happen and you can use softened water, and I was lucky enough to fall into that category. So for years I was keeping fish in softened water, and it was tricky. I lost some fish, not knowing why, but I do now, of course. But at any rate, that's what set me off on my journey down the road of understanding water chemistry better and beginning, you know, once you lift up that rock, my God, you know, everything is so interconnected. You can't start learning about pH without learning about water hardness, and then carbonate hardness and general hardness, and all the differences between the two. And of course, the first thing I needed to learn was how in the hell does a water softening system work. So I had to start learning about ion exchange resins, and I had to start learning chemistry. It's been interesting. It's been a lot of fun. I've kept a marine tank. Not my thing. It's very different than keeping planted freshwater tanks. I do have a brackish tank. I struggle with that. It's grown with the cyanobacteria and the algae. It's just a different experience than my other tanks. I've also learned a lot about myself in this process and the types of tanks I'm, what I'll say, capable of keeping. I understand how to manage a coral reef tank. Am I capable of doing that? Personally, I don't think I am. Just because I know how to do something doesn't mean I'm capable of doing something. So I've learned what I can do and what I can't do. I've had people ask me if I'm ever going to have a high-tech tank, and the answer is no. It's just not my thing. I just don't even have a desire to do that. From what I've done with the other tanks I've done and the different stuff I've done, I've experimented with CO2 in the past, not in aquatic environments, but it's just more hassle than I want. The joy of it for me is the simplicity of my tanks, and I'll go over one day, I'll do another video about how I manage my tanks as far as the high-tech versus low-tech and the additives I use and don't use, and you know how low-tech my tanks really are. You can't get much lower tech than my tanks, but you could take the filter and the light off, and that's about as much as you could reduce how low-tech my tanks are. But that's what I like, and that's my thing. That's what all my tanks are. If you're familiar with my fish room, you know what it's sort of evolved into over time. But all of this began, and let me talk about the different types of experience you can get. I don't have a lot of experience in terms of duration. That fish tank we began talking about a while ago, that little tank that came home from my wife's job, was about 4 to maybe 4.5 years ago, tops 4.5 years ago. So within 6 months or so, maybe we'll call it 4 years, 3.5 years ago, is when I got the 10-gallon tank. And then it was maybe 3 years ago that I got my 29-gallon miscellaneous and was off and running. So what I know now and the amount of experience people seem to credit me with, I've gained all of that in 3 years of serious fish keeping. You could say 4 if you want to count the first tentative years of not really even knowing whether or not I should do a water change. So total, I've got about 4 years of fish keeping under my belt. So that does limit my experience in a certain way. There's certain experience you can only get from time. You know, I've got fish that might have 15 or 20 year lifespans, and while I might have kept them alive for 3 or 4 years, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a good fish keeper. If I can't keep them alive beyond 5 or 6, that's still a third of their lifespan. That doesn't mean I'm a very good fish keeper necessarily. Now, I have gone long enough that some of the shorter-lived fish, I've got some experience with them. I know I can keep them alive for the duration. I've got some neons in my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank that have been there from way back. So they went through some rough treatment in the beginning of me being really, you know, not really knowing what I was doing. All my amateur days were with that tank. I've got loaches in there that have been in there since the beginning, and again, the loaches might be a 15-year fish, but they're very sensitive fish as well, and they're still very good and healthy after several years. I've got skirt tetras. I've got genetically modified, you know, the glow light, or not the glow light. That's what we're looking at in this tank. The glowfish skirt tetras. I have glowfish that are almost 3 years old in my tank. So I'm getting to the point now where I feel comfortable saying I've got some experience, and I, you know, no longer feel like a rank amateur that doesn't really know what I'm talking about and should do a lot more listening and a lot less talking. I really feel like I'm to the point now where if you are a beginner, you know, I don't think I'm going to be teaching any professionals anything, but if you're a beginner and you're just coming up into the hobby and you just want someone's experience who's a little down the road ahead of you, then, you know, you've found the right videos. But there's 2 kinds of experience, as I said, and the other kind of experience is the experience that comes from sheer volume, and it also comes from tinkering. You know, let's face it, I do a lot of tinkering with my tanks. I know this is questionable whether it's ethical or not, but I've lost a lot of fish due to my tinkering. I knew what I was doing was risky, and I attempted it. You know, I've done experiments with allowing nitrates to build up to see the effect it had on animals. Again, ethical? I don't know. You know, we can have that argument if you want. But I learned a lot about nitrates, and I learned a lot about how to manage a tank, and, you know, on and on and on. I've done a lot in the last 3 years that most people never dream of doing. It never crosses their mind to question that. And yet I've done experiments with it already. You know, so who's got more experience, me or somebody who's kept fish for 20 years, but he's got 1 tank and he's never had a single issue with it, and he's just had a couple of koi fish living in the same tank for 20 years? That's a very valuable type of experience. You know, that takes skill, that takes patience, it takes, you know, steadfastness. There's a lot of quality that comes from that type of experience. But it's a very different kind of experience than the experience I've got, which is, I mean, I think I currently have over 400 gallons of fish tank total. I know I have over 175 different animals, and that's currently, right now in my care, I have over 175 aquatic animals. And that's, you know, if you want to count the ones I've had over the last 3 years, you know, it was just hundreds and hundreds of animals. Now, I'll grant you a lot of them were killed, but that was experience gained. It was lessons learned, so on and so forth. So that's pretty much where we are now, and that kind of gets you up to date with where my experience is. As far as the love of the hobby, I think I pretty much covered that. It's just absolutely fascinating. Not only do I love fish and plants and gardening and, you know, aquatic environments and all that, I just love learning, and I'm just fascinated by interesting things. And if you don't think keeping an entire ecosystem and being, you know, in control of every aspect of that ecosystem, from the temperature to the pH to the water hardness to the chemical components that are in the water, you know, I mean, just everything, that to me is just an absolutely fascinating hobby, and you can never stop learning. You know, even at the rate I chow through doing stuff, if I do this and I keep moving at the rate I'm going, I could do this the rest of my life and I will still be learning stuff. You can just never stop learning in this hobby. that to me is fascinating. You know, putting puzzles together is something you do to kill time. You know, making models, again, it might be interesting, you might enjoy it. I'm not knocking you if you build models or put puzzles together, but to me that's something you do to kill time. You know, keeping fish to me is something I do to just, it's just brain food. I learn all the time from keeping fish. And that might simply be by sitting here watching my fish. I learn about their behavior and I learn how they interact. There's just a lot you can get out of this hobby, and it just never ever ends. It just goes and goes and goes. So whether you've got one tank or 20, enjoy them. So thanks for watching that video. Thanks again for all the subscribers. If you've sat through all this, God bless you. I know most people probably don't ever make it all the way to the end of my videos, but if you do, that's great. I really do appreciate it, and thanks again. I will see you real soon on the next one.